My name is Mário Dalpoz. I'm a professor of the Social Medicine Institute of the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. And I'm going to talk about the global health as invited by the organizers of this course. Initially, I would say that the backdrop of this lecture is the huge boom that we have seen in the field of global health in recent years. We have witnessed a huge influx of new resources and new players in the field of global health. There has been a kind of population explosion with the new global health programs, especially large-scale global health initiatives, or GHIs, popping up all over. Whether we think of Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, Bono, or Angelina Jolie, it's clear that global health has become one of the philanthropic and celebrity causes of the 21st century. In analyzing any area of work, it's always useful to follow the money, and there is probably nothing that so clearly illustrates the global health boom as the influx of funds. As a study carried out by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington has demonstrated, development assistance for global health has risen from almost $6 billion in 1990 to $22 billion in 2007. And even after the fiscal crisis and downturn beginning in 2008, global health has remained at the very top of the donor priority list, even in times of economic downturn, as shown in the most recent study from the IHME published this year, 2017. One of the things that we want to ask ourselves over this lecture is how and why global health has become so central to public health in the early 21st century. This overarching objective for today's lecture can be summarized in this title: Shifting Paradigms, Tropical Medicine, International Health, and Global Health. First, we'll try to trace the history of global health as a field, beginning with the emergence of tropical medicine. Then, we will examine the emergence of international health and development approaches after the Second World War. Finally, we'll seek to explore the shift from international to a global perspective as a result of increasing globalization, beginning in the 80s and 90s and deepening as a fundamental paradigm shift in the 2000s. Yet, as important as both context and history are, I also want to emphasize that there are multiple histories, or at least multiple historical perspectives that can be brought to the study of any topic, and the field of global health is no exception. The history of global health can be approached from a number of different perspectives and can emphasize a number of different sets of issues. There are three articles that I'm going to give you the reference later that can help us on that. The first one was from Sarah McFarlane and colleagues, for example. It provides one version of the history of global health, focusing especially on the production and organization of knowledge and collaboration in the field. The second, from Emmanuel Berni, on the other hand, provides a history of how success has been defined in the field of this work, and tends to emphasize much more the policy and program that can have defined success in relation to the world health issues. And the third one, from Ted Brown, Marcus Cueto, and Elizabeth Fee, comes at this history from yet another perspective, focusing on key institutional players with a special focus on the World Health Organization and the number of competing institutions in looking at the transition to the field of global health as we know it today. So I very much draw my lecture today on these three histories to tell a history or a story of the emergence of global health. But I will place special emphasis on what can be described as the key paradigms that have organized work in this field over time. the idea of paradigms as a way of thinking about fields of work was developed most influentially by the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn nearly 50 years ago in his extremely influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In that work, Kuhn defined a paradigm as the accepted theories, values, and scientific practices within which a particular field operates. He focused primarily on paradigms in the natural science and developed an analysis on how paradigms shift over time, emphasizing the dominance of certain paradigms during certain periods, the ways in which dominant paradigms are called into question during periods of paradigm shift, and the ways in which new paradigms come to take place the older ones. A traditional example is, for example, the change or the shift from Newtonian physics to Einstein physics in the theory of relativity, for example. In other fields and other areas, particularly in the human science, paradigm shifts also take place, but paradigms are often less absolute of dominant than they are in the natural science. They are more likely to coexist and even compete in shaping the evolution of different fields of research and practice. Based in McFarlane reading, I think there is some level of case with the three major paradigms that have shaped the research and practice on health in international settings. Emphasize that in presenting this overview of shifting paradigms, we're not focusing primarily on the history of the past, but rather on the history of the present. We don't expect you to come away with a detailed understanding of tropical medicine or international health, but primarily to understand that the contemporary field of global health has deep historical roots, and that there are some aspects of historical antecedents that can help us to better understand how it operates in the present. With this in mind, in looking at the historical roots of global health in the paradigm of tropical medicine, there are at least four key things that is worth emphasizing: climate, commerce, colonialism, and conflict. 4 Cs. Tropical medicine began to emerge as early in the middle to late 18th century, with the notion of miasma playing a central role. The idea that rooting material, waste, filth, and stagnant waterways gave rise to gaseous discharge that in turn led to disease. While waste and filth were of course well known in Europe, North America at this time, there was a notion that the hot climate of the tropics made it an especially unhealthy place, linking disease and a medical specialty to geography rather than parts of the body, between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and by extension to all warm climates. The most authoritative test on tropical medicine for almost 100 years, as Manson's tropical disease, described itself as a manual of the disease of warm climates. The zenith of tropical medicine was probably the mid to late 19th century, although it continues to be a specialty in medicine and public health until now. And it was without question a focus on both colonialism and commerce that gave it much of its focus. European expansion was in part linked to yet another sea, spreading Christianity, but was driven above all else by the need to colonize other parts of the world in order to extract natural resources increasingly necessary for the Industrial Revolution, and to open up new opportunities for commerce, both of which frequently led to conflict and even full-blown war. I think we need to remember the importance of religion at that time that was quite key in being associated and develop this process of colonization. In the first instance, maintaining the health of the colonized was the primary focus, and later, as the bodies of the colonized began to become important as a labor power, the health of the colonized also began to become a growing focus. Commerce and tropical medicine were entwined from the very beginning in the early schools of tropical medicine and hygiene in Liverpool in 1898, and later in the London School of Health, Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in 1899, were founded with the help of businessmen in Britain, and later in Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, and even USA. The geopolitics of colonial project had a major influence on these developments, with European powers focusing primarily on their colonies in Africa and Asia, and the US primarily on its colonial or neo-colonial areas of interest in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. An important boost for the expansion of tropical medicine took place with the First World War, especially in the European and Middle Eastern theaters, and in the Americas, where battles against yellow fever were an important part of the Spanish-American War that later made it possible to building of the Panama Canal. The fight against yellow fever, malaria, filariasis, a parasitic disease caused by roundworms, leprosy or Hansen disease, were all given important emphasis in relation to early 20th century military campaigns. So, just as miasmas and mosquitoes were especially closely associated with the tropical medicine paradigm, so too were climate, commerce, colonialism, and conflict. Out of this mix of forces, throughout the colonial period, the schools and institutes focused on tropical or colonial medicine, and in many cases, the first schools of public health that were created in most countries were formed in countries around the world, training thousands of doctors equipped for colonial services, and conducting research into the mechanism of disease transmission, both in the colonies and among colonialists, returning home to the colonial powers. So, even though we are not asking you to become experts on tropical medicine as a result of this course, we do want to highlight a number of important lessons that revisiting that history can offer for more recent attempts to develop what today we describe as a global health. They might be thought of the lasting legacies of tropical medicine paradigm. First, it's especially important to remember that social and political history provides a crucial context for understanding the history of public health efforts. Second, the deployment of power and the deployment of knowledge are closely linked and will continue to be so to the present. Finally, the geopolitical interest and conflicts, closely linked to commercial interest and conflicts, play a key role in shaping approach toward health. While the McFarland article makes clear that important aspects of tropical medicine paradigm continue to operate even today and to actually dominate, at least in quantity, scientific output and production, it's clear that a major paradigm shift began to take place at more or less at the time of the Second War in the 40s. It was at that time, and then continuing from the middle 20th century for nearly the end of 20th century, that a very different world order began to emerge and to replace the colonial world order that had given rise to tropical medicine and public health in the tropics. The breakup of the old colonial system and the establishment of a new international system was at the heart of this shift. But if the colonial empires of the 19th century and the early 20th centuries began to give way, it was hardly to be replaced by utopia of peace and cooperation imagined and articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but rather by a sharply divided world of what would ultimately become the Cold War, with its conflicting visions, interests in the major two blocs, US and Soviet blocs. While much of the history of this second paradigm, the paradigm of international health, would be played out against the history of the Cold War, it was clearly out of the idealist hope for a more just international system, perhaps most clearly articulated in the creation of the United Nations system and the various intergovernmental organizations that would come to make up that system. That the values underlying the international health paradigm would take shape. I think it's better. The WHO was, of course, at the heart of this vision, at least in relation to health. But many of the other UN agencies also had an important stake in an important contribution to making in relation different aspects of health and human well-being, just as other agencies, like the global financial institutions that grew out of the Bretton Woods Accords, like the World Bank and the IMF, and a growing range of international non-governmental organizations like the philanthropic foundations that began to emerge as increasingly important players on the international scene. Just how different this vision was from the vision that dominated the early tropical medicine paradigm can be appreciated, perhaps by comparing this little promotion, comparing some of the issues that celebrate the anniversary of WHO. There are visions. The WHO, for example, made a promotional film celebrating its anniversary, showing the contribution in tropical medicine in Nigeria and Colombia. And this is one of the good examples. It was very emblematic, that the way that the WHO presented the relation with the war against mosquitoes and the different diseases in the tropics was certainly for sure the focus on the work that these organizations were doing at that time. But at the same time, conflicts and different geopolitical interests continue to grow in this field of international health. And the Cold War played a major role in this process. Particular trouble was the continuing parts of geopolitical conflicts, as I said, in different interests that in many ways play a role in the history of colonialism, but also in the complicated relationship between the northern powers that approach the health challenges of the former colonies. And this is particularly clear when the new, this is now was a new conception that today you have of the third world. That time, and the third world was a bloc that contrasted with the two blocks, the Soviet Union and its allies, and the American and allies. The third world at that time became a contested terrain. International health became one of the fields in which this campaign was waged, among the other fields. If maintaining health in the colonizers, and only to a secondary extent the colonized, was the key focus of an early period, following the Second World War, as the Cold War began to take shape, a new emphasis began to be articulated in modernization and economic, as well as social, cultural, and political development to the so-called Third World. This was in many ways a profound advance in relation to the colonial past, but nonetheless also contained a kind of neo-colonialism, a notion of the developed world as somehow inferior in relation to the developed nations, whether the vision of superiority was capitalist and democratic or socialist and authoritarian. And there is certainly a reading of the founding of the United Nations with the Security Council and its vetoes, a little more than a rearrangement of the interests of dominant powers. Wolf in sheep's clothing, perhaps, that did little to truly transform the relations of core and periphery, power and domination that had characterized the colonial world. And you can see this in different ways that the caricaturists present the conflict, and the colors that the different words were presented. But also in the new discussions, as the population control, for example. The debates around population control was very complicated and with contested values. It was worth to note that population was one of the key battlegrounds for many of the ideological debates that would characterize this new focus on modernization and development, and also the way that the third world was viewed as a way of developing its economy. The recipe was to work in population control. The major investment was made by both blocks, West Bloc and Socialist Bloc, over controlling population as a key to advance the development of countries. And also, of course, to satisfy the continued needs for natural resources and raw material that both blocks desperately need, not only to the industrialized countries, but to both blocks. Of the second half of the 20th century, important challenges would emerge to the population control orthodoxy of the early post-World War, of Second World War period. And the transnational women's reproductive health and rights movement would ultimately push back in ways that would transform this field, in which we'll discuss later on. But early heyday of modernization, development thinking, out of control, population growth was seen as one of the greatest threats to development, health, and well-being internationally. But the history of international health and, of course, the World Health Organization developed over time and shifted in many important ways of the 50 years that followed the WHO creation in 1948. While you don't have time to go into extensive detail in this regard, it's worth highlighting a number of key developments. The 50s and the 60s, for example, were marked by the development of series of large-scale disease eradication campaigns that were coordinated globally by the WHO. For example, the successful global malaria eradication campaign that was initiated in 1955, and the ultimately successful smallpox eradication campaign that was started in 1959 and then reinitiated and intensified in 1967. Behind these campaigns was often intense competition between the US and the Soviet Union, but much of their success and some evidence of WHO's diplomatic importance can be found in the fact that they were in many ways dependent on a certain degree of collaboration between the two superpowers and their allies. I think it's worth to mention an author called Keeley Lee made several books on international global health, but especially one that he made on the WHO history, to the ones who have interest. By the 60s and the 70s, however, important changes had begun to take place, not only politically, but also socially and culturally, that would come to have a major impact on the field of international health. The kind of confidence in modernization development that often led to a deep faith in technological solutions and developments, and sometimes in technocratic approach to human problems, also began to wane. A set of new social movements had begun to emerge around the world in the 60s, challenging the orthodoxies of the Cold War and the values underlying both the capitalist and state socialist alternative. The movements of the 60s were felt in international health as well, with new doubts emerging about technocratic approaches, including highly vertical eradication campaigns organized along technocratic lines, with a new emphasis gradually emerging on community mobilization and development, on human development as opposed to economic development. These tensions were, of course, evident in the world of international organizations themselves, UNDP, World Bank, etc. The new developments were evident in events ranging from the creation of Medicine Sans Frontières, for example, in 1971, and WHO UNICEF-sponsored Almata Conference on Primary Health Care in 1978. The 1980s was a key transitional decade where a number of key things happened that would have a major impact on this field in the future. First, there was a surge on what has come to be known as neoliberalism, with the election of the Reagan and Thatcher governments in the US and UK, and an extension of this policy to the so-called Third World through World Bank and IMF interventions. At the start of the decade, the first case of HIV were reporting, initiating what would become a game-changing epidemic in the field of global health. It suddenly became apparent that the first world, third world divide doesn't hold for new emergency epidemics. The World Bank promoted structural adjustment, but also entered heavily into health to address negative effects of structural adjustment, thus starting to compete with WHO, as the article from Brown, Cueto, and Fis described very well, for leadership in the field of international health. And by the end of the decade, the Berlin Wall had crumbled and the Soviet Union had self-destructed, ending 40 years of Cold War, and initiate a new process of organization in the existing world order that would have important consequences for health and development more generally. Finally, emerging out of the 1980s and coming to center stage in the 90s, influenced both by the cultural and political changes that degenerate the people's health movement and by more localized struggles and social movements associated with HIV/AIDS and with reproductive health and rights, as opposed to population control, we also see the growth of struggles for health and human rights and for health and social justice that would provide an important counter or even alternative to demonstrate orthodoxy of a more technocratic approach to public health globally. These movements also provide a crucial backdrop for the shift that began to take place in the middle to late 1990s from the field of international health that had emerged at roughly the end of the Second World War to the field of global health, as it has been reframed during the past decade to decade and a half. Following the end of the Cold War, one of the key challenges taken up globally in the 1990s was the rethinking of what security means in the post-Cold War world. Issues of development, health, and well-being all came to be examined through the lens of security, food security, health security, and so on. HIV/AIDS, which by the 90s was widely recognized as a major global epidemic linking the wealthy North and the resource-poor South, had a pivotal role in relation to this reframing, as well as in leading the influx of new research that we mentioned at the start of this lecture. Indeed, there are many ways in which HIV/AIDS can be seen as a battleground through which the new frame of the global was rolled out. The global program the global program on AIDS, created by WHO in the mid-80s, was one of the first programs to use the notion of the global and to raise a health issue to the level not just of the WHO but to the UN General Assembly. The creation of UNAIDS in 1996 the first HIV/AIDS special session of the General Assembly in 2001, the creation in 2002 of the private-public partnership known as a Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and the launch in 2003 of the US government's PEPFAR project are all symptomatic of key features of the emerging global health paradigm. Interesting that this model, especially when special sessions, etc., is also taking place in other diseases now. Non-communicable diseases, tuberculosis, and there are other diseases or other groups pressing for this same path. So, two was the mobilization of civil society globally around health issues that took place in relation to HIV, and prioritization of social justice and human rights, health issues such as access to treatment and battles of the proper relationship that should exist in relation to free trade, intellectual property rights, and basic health needs. It was first really in relation to HIV and AIDS that we see an important flux of new private research, such as those of billionaires as Bill Gates or Warren Buffett into the global health field. It was also first and foremost in relation to HIV and AIDS that then quickly, more broadly in relation to other issues. For example, IAVI became Gavi in the area of vaccines. The Global Fund serving as a model for other new global health initiatives, GIs in the 2000s. The idea of public-private partnership and the importance of private philanthropies and private research began to move into the space of states, intergovernmental agencies, and other official actors. None of this was unheard, and I have seen business leaders that have been at the forefront of building world health response since the very start of the tropical medicine paradigm in private institute foundations such as Rockefeller, Ford, and MacArthur have been investing in health, population development for much of the past century. But the size of scale in which these actors have entered the field of global health in the past decades is really unheard of in the early periods. Bill Gates is obviously the most emblematic figure, although others like Carlos Slim from Mexico, Ratan Tata from India, and others are now entering where Gates was pioneered. And indeed, a large number of new and perhaps unexpected actors have become engaged in global health work at the level that may not have been achieved previously, but this is not entirely unheard of in those early paradigms, on the contrary. So, as you can see in the slide, there's so many groups in the global arena that even is difficult to understand how they are linked and the effort to make them to move and the effort to make a consensus or to do some work. WHO estimates today at least 45% of the AIDS-related services provided around the world are carried out by religious and faith-based organizations. And these same organizations have been especially quick to move beyond HIV/AIDS and to broader field of global health. As the popular social movement concerned with health, while not entirely new, has taken place in ways and at levels that were never seen before in the history of world health, as you saw from the previous slides. The result of this various development in the emergence of what might be described as a new global health architecture in the 21st century. So you have this at least in three different levels: the level of governments, and civil society, and private sector. So these different types of organizations, we could see this in the previous slides, are what we call now the new architecture of global health. And this is so complicated that just to give you a sense of the complexity, if we follow the money, and this is what one example from what Global Health Watch did, you can see that a huge increase of spending for global health is moved from these different sources. So official governments, private foundations, other private organizations, moving to multilateral funding agencies, global health funding agencies, bilateral programs, UN agencies, all and partnerships, all towards the governments themselves or no-state actors. And in some cases, just the case of Tanzania, you can see here, a country certainly has difficult to deal with this, so many actors and mechanisms that are put in the same space and sometimes fighting of something that we call the flag war, trying to also make sense of their contribution, but sometimes fighting or collaborating. In many cases, we have good examples of that in this field. Clearly, this does not negate the point made Cohen in an article in Science that uses these examples to show the responsibility of HIV/AIDS in helping or pushing, leveraging the process. And this has been a very long lecture so far. So I apologize for the different things and to compress in this very short period of time. But there are worrying trends currently that we need to look at that and to think how we can discuss and understand the current trends in global health. The first one, there's some inability to really change paradigm and to take the global health seriously as a new paradigm. There's the continuity of there's a continued unequal power relation between North and South. The crisis of 2008 is not finished yet, so there is an impact in many organizations. We can see this in the WHO and other technical agencies. The reduction in the contribution for the financial maintenance, the inability to build a critical reflection on the tendency of this field, and recent direction of policy in the world that is worrying the decisions and the leaders, some of the discussions to reduce the amount of money that the agencies and the organizations dealing with the global health are working, but also decisions that may impact the way that we see this architecture today, and the way that the world is working toward this the reduction of some disease or controlling other disease. So, trying to end this long talk, I would say that global health has a history, and the history was emerging over time as a key field within public health more broadly. Over more than a century, this field has been shaped by a set of shifting paradigms, yet elements of each of these paradigms still shape approach to this field today. A full understanding of this evolving field is only possible if we pay close attention to the social, cultural, political, and economic forces that have shaped these paradigms over time. Paying attention to this force is much more than just academic exercise. Our ability to act strategically within this field to advance the cause of global health is inseparable from our ability to critically analyze this force. The flexibility about the structure and dynamics of this field is crucial to our ability to design and implement meaningful policies and programs in the contemporary world. I think this and my contributions. And I would like to thank you very much to participate and attend this discussion. Thank you.
My name is João Nunes. I'm from the University of York, where I am a lecturer in international relations. And this lecture is titled Health Security and Health Emergencies. And what I want to do is to provide an overview of what health security means, what it entails, and its connection with the concept of emergency. And I will do so by not only surveying the landscape of the literature on health security, but also using some case studies to illustrate what I mean and to ground some of my arguments. So just to give an overview of what this lecture will consist of, I will start by providing you with an overview of the context in which we can begin to speak of health security, in which the term health security has become important and relevant in world politics. I will then provide an argument in which I will unpack the meaning of health security and argue that we can have four distinct approaches to health security. And each of these approaches actually gives us very different understandings of what health security means, what the problems are, what security or insecurity might mean in each context. So these four visions of health security that I will be providing today are threat, risk, securitization, and finally vulnerability. After doing this conceptual groundwork, which I hope will help us to kind of give us a more sophisticated view of health security, I'm going to illustrate this argument by drawing and focusing on two case studies. First one is the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and the second one is particularly relevant to UNASUR context, is the Zika outbreak, Zika and microcephaly situation in Latin America. Okay, so to begin with, to speak a bit about the context in which health security became an important term and term of reference for many health policies and for many processes of discussion about health at the global stage. The context is one that originates mainly in the post-World War period, in which after the confrontation, or after the end of the confrontation between the two superpowers, many authors and many experts and politicians began to speak of so-called new security threats. So it was suddenly kind of a vacuum after the end of the Cold War confrontation, and people began to speak of new security threats. And among these new security threats were threats like environmental threats, or ethnic conflict, or civil wars. There was a debate about new wars, for example. And one of these supposed new threats was a renewed concern with infectious disease under the category of the newly emerging diseases. And there was a big growth in the literature on supposed effects or security implications of these newly emerging diseases, particularly infectious diseases. And Laurie Garrett's book, The Coming Plague, is one example of this growing concern with diseases and their security implications. Another important event that triggered this renewed interest in global health and from the perspective of security was, of course, the growth of or the occurrence of bioterrorist events, bioterrorist attacks. Two examples are the Tokyo subway attack in 1995 using sarin gas, and obviously the anthrax attacks in the wake of 9/11. And what these two instances, or these two events contributed to, was to place health at the center stage of the security context, of the security agenda. So suddenly, because of the bioterrorism, because of the concern about the possible weaponization of these agents, health security became center stage, which was, up until then, it was a kind of secondary, was in a secondary position, and became suddenly very important and very central to the security agenda. And this post 9/11 context, more broadly, can be conceived as a security-centered or a security-focused context. After 9/11, we see the growth of the use of security as a grammar, as a rhetoric, as a language to speak of problems. So suddenly, everything became a security problem. So we spoke increasingly of energy security, of environmental security, of economic security, etc. And of course, health was not an exception. And in this case, health security as a term became actually a household and a buzzword for many policy publications and many policy discussions. One example is the revision of the international health regulations, which explicitly stated as their goal to reinforce, to build international public health security. So it was not merely about enhancing public health, but it was about enhancing public health security. So this kind of brings a different understanding of what exactly the objectives were. It's not simply about health, it was about health security. So security became quite important in this context, and it's useful then to analyze what exactly is meant by security. What does security bring that is new? What is its added value to the table? And so that's the objective of what I'm going to present in the next few minutes. So why are we speaking about health security? What does it mean? What does it do? What does health security do? What are its implications? Now, in order to approach health security, I think it's important to first understand that we should not take health security for granted. It is not that suddenly there are these unquestionable security threats out there in the world that we can suddenly observe and that are suddenly important. No, I think it's important to see security as a particular narrative of global health. In the same way that we have human rights as narratives, as lenses with which to see global health, or development as a lens, as a frame to understand global health, security is one of these frames. And it is a frame, as I've explained in the past few minutes, that has become particularly important in the post 9/11 context. But it is a frame nonetheless. It is just one way to understand global health, to understand what is insecure, who is insecure, how health issues are conceived and are framed as problems. So in order to approach health security, to begin to understand what health security means, we need to ask a couple of preliminary questions. And these questions pertain to what exactly is meant by health security? Whose security are we talking about? Okay, so these questions are important. What is the reference? That is, who is to be rendered secure? Who is insecure? And how is insecurity affecting this particular reference? And also, how are health issues being conceived as security problems? And what I'm about to say in the next few minutes is to see how using different understandings of health security can actually leads to very different understandings of what is the problem with health security, what is the meaning of insecurity, right? So, security is not a take it for granted reality. It's not kind of a self-evident reality. It is a frame, it is a lens that allows us to ask certain questions, that gives us certain answers, but at the same time forecloses or silences or obscures other ways of approaching the problem. Okay? So moving on, and I've said that I was going to look at 4 different meanings of health security. And these 4 are threat, which is the most common. And I'm going to talk about risk. Then I'm going to talk about securitization. And finally, I'm going to talk about vulnerability. So let's begin with threat. And this is the most obvious. And this was the first way in which health security was conceived, not only by the academic literature, but also by the policy makers and by policy documents. And in the beginning, when people started talking about health security, there was one particular problem that attracted the attention not just of academics, but also policymakers and media. And this was the high incidence of HIV/AIDS in some African countries, particularly in Sub-Saharan. And the reason why this was suddenly this stopped being simply a matter of human rights or a matter of development or a matter of public health and became a matter of security was because suddenly people started thinking about, reflecting about the implications of this high incidence of HIV/AIDS, particularly in what concerned the preparedness of the armed forces of these African countries. So suddenly there was a security element that was introduced to this debate about HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa. Was the preparedness of armed forces, which had, according to these authors, according to these experts, which had or potentially could have implications at the level of the instability of political regimes, at the level of the regional instability or potential promotion of political and economic discord between countries. So there were security-based concerns here that were particularly important. So this was a very state-centric approach. The concern here was about the stability of regimes and about potential war or conflict or instability between states. And health problems were conceived as clear and present dangers. So this was something that was happening that presented a clear danger that needed to be tackled. So this was the first conception of health security. The second one was risk. And here the focus was not simply on clear and present dangers, as the threat-based rationale argued, but more broadly on events that may constitute problems in the future. So risk, whereas the threat-based rationale is based upon or is predicated upon clear and present dangers, so dangers that are observed and can be observed in the present, the risk-based rationale is focused on the future. And is focused on an attempt to calculate and predict uncertain futures. One example here is the International Health Regulations, 2005 version, which very interestingly introduce the concept of the international health event that is, for example, seen in the legal figure of the public health emergency of international concern. So these international health regulations, what they signal is not simply a concern with specific diseases. Previous international health regulations focused only on specific diseases, on a predefined list of diseases. The 2005 version of these regulations moves beyond specific diseases and actually focuses on events, or events that may constitute a problem in the future. And the figure here in the slide, you can see the decision tree for determining whether it should of public health emergency of international concern. And it actually says that events detected by national surveillance systems. So it's not about diseases specifically, it's about events, kind of a broader, fuzzier notion of events. And we will see when I look at the case of Zika, how the definition of an event was actually crucial for declaring Zika an international public health emergency of international concern. So this is the second way in which we can conceive health security, is more focused on the future, attempt to calculate the future, and focusing on broad events that may constitute problems in the future. The third one is called securitization. Securitization is a term introduced in academic literature to analyze the ways in which threats are socially constructed. So the basic reasoning behind the securitization literature is this idea that you cannot see or you cannot approach threats as being self-evident realities that can be observed out there in the world. You can just look and identify, look, there's a threat there. That's undeniably a threat. No. For securitization authors, what you have is social processes through which threats are constructed. Threats are social facts. They are not kind of material, observable, hard facts. Security is done, security is constructed through the interaction between the securitizing actor who presents the issue as a security threat, the speech act, a speech act through which the threat is presented as an existential threat, and the audience who accepts or not this move. So what you have here is not, threats are not objective, they are constructed intersubjectively between the securitizing actor and the audience. And what the securitization means is that an issue, a particular issue, for example, a disease or climate change or terrorism or whatever, is presented as an existential threat to a particular weapon object, demanding exceptional measures. The key element in the securitization is, the key elements are, on one hand, there is an existential threat. On the other hand, it demands exceptional measures. That's why the securitization literature is very often connected with emergency measures. So what you have is security having an impact in political procedure, an impact that normally entails going beyond or bypassing normal democratic procedures, and it involves exceptional politics, involves militarization, and normally involves a rationale that focuses on crisis management. So events are portrayed, or issues are portrayed as an existential crisis, and they demand exceptional measures because they are emergencies. And here we see how health security, through securitization, is very often connected with the concept of emergency. So this is an existential threat, that is a threat that puts into question the very existence of a particular referent, like, for example, a state or a society or a group of people, etc. So it's an existential threat that demands exceptional measures. So we're talking about emergencies. Finally, we can talk about health security as being more closely connected with vulnerability. And this is personally my favorite, or the way I tend to approach issues of health security. The question here is not simply about how issues are constructed by elites or by states or by powerful actors, how issues are securitized. The issue here is focused on specific instances of insecurity at the individual level. So we saw that previous versions of health security were very often state-centric. They were concerned with the security concerns of states, for example, the preparedness of armed forces, or the security concerns of elites who securitize the particular issue with certain goals in mind, certain political goals in mind. Now, with vulnerability, or with the vulnerability-centered approach to health security, what we have is the individual experiences of insecurity. And here, it is a very bottom-up, it's very based on kind of experience of insecurity on the ground. So here, in this context, health insecurity means a person or an individual or a group having insufficient certainty about and control over their own life and their surrounding environment. So we can conceive someone as being insecure in questions of health when that person is unable to influence the factors that may impact upon their health. So here, the question is not on these national emergencies that require militarization or that require emergency measures that require the bypassing of democratic procedures. No, the question here is about the so-called everyday emergencies, the experiences that people feel every day that they impact upon their health, be it, for example, access to life-saving medication, access for antiretrovirals, for example, be it, for example, access to safe water or sanitation facilities. These are everyday emergencies because they impact decisively upon person's health, upon their well-being, and even upon their life and their survival. So we can talk about health insecurity existing when there are these vulnerabilities, these individual vulnerabilities, these day-to-day vulnerabilities that can be considered everyday emergencies. Okay, so having surveyed these 4 ways in which we can conceive health security, to summarize, a threat, risk, securitization, and vulnerability, I want to look now at 2 case studies. So I wanted to first look at a little bit about the case of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which was in many aspects an example of securitization. So there was a focus on the exceptional character of the problem, about the disease, the outbreak being an existential threat to West African societies, and then more broadly to Western nations as Western nationals became infected. And this emphasized the exceptional nature. So it was framed as an emergency, as a crisis. And this, of course, led to a particular modality of response, a particular modality of response that was based on containment, on disease containment, the establishment of cordon sanitaire, the imposition of curfews, as you can see on this, the militarization of certain neighborhoods in West Africa, and crisis management. But this happened, arguably, to the detriment of looking in more detail at the individual vulnerabilities and the everyday emergencies. So this is where I think that the response, the health security response to Ebola, was insufficient, because there was a lot of emphasis being placed on securitization of the disease, but less emphasis being placed and less attention being paid to the question of the everyday vulnerabilities, the everyday emergencies. So some examples of these: the social and economic conditions that gave rise to the outbreak in the first place. These remain largely untackled, largely unaddressed, even after the Ebola outbreak is ended. The fact that the West African nations, by and large, have very weak public health systems, that they have low levels of sanitation infrastructure, that there are low levels of trust between politicians and the public, between health authorities and the public, and arguably that there are these global inequalities. So these are all examples of these everyday emergencies, these everyday problems that the people in West Africa experience on a daily basis, and that have not been addressed, and have not been given sufficient attention, even after this outbreak. So Ebola, in my view, there was a lot of attention being paid to Ebola. There was a huge spectacle being constructed around Ebola. But arguably, the question is, what kind of attention is being given about Ebola? It was not the quantity of attention, but it was about the quality of the attention being given to Ebola. So there was a lot of mentions of Ebola on social media, but they were mostly joke material, or they were mostly postings in other publications that had little or scarce factual information. So there was a lot of attention given to Ebola, but it was arguably not the right attention, and not the attention that would give particular or that would give rise to a long-term sustainable response to the conditions that rise to Ebola in the first place. So there was, for example, an attempt to racialize Ebola, as you can see, for example, in this Newsweek story that kind of portrayed Ebola as a result of the bushmeat consumption, as the kind of the result of disgusting exotic habits of Africans. And this led to racialization of the disease, to the stigmatization of people from West Africa. And this did not solve in any way the daily insecurities and daily vulnerabilities that people in West Africa experience in their lives. So actually Ebola, I think, my opinion is that it remained by and large a neglected issue. A lot of attention was being paid to a particular kind of bottles, that the fact that there were some Western nationals being affected by this, but the daily suffering of West Africans and the populations in these most infected countries remain silenced and remain neglected. And even today, sometime after this disease, they remain unaddressed. Let's move on now to my second case, which is the case of Zika in Latin America, which I think has interesting parallels with the Ebola case that I just mentioned. Again, Zika was portrayed as a particular emergency, as a health emergency, but it was portrayed as a particular kind of problem. The dominant frame, the dominant narrative in which Zika was portrayed by governments was arguably the idea that Zika was a problem of mosquitoes, and that henceforth Zika was a problem of vector control. So in order to solve the problem of Zika, you had to control the spread of mosquitoes. You had to devise and you had to implement technological interventions that could get rid of, wipe out mosquito populations, or at least control the number of mosquitoes. And this, for example, was visible in the fumigation strategies in many regions in Latin America, particularly Brazil. The other issue that was important in the Zika response was the focus on individual behavior. If we only, this is the reasoning of the government, if only we can change individual behavior, for example, the attention that people pay to water reservoirs and to water containers in their backyards, if we can prevent people from having potential mosquito breeding sites in their backyards, we will be able to tackle Zika. Now, this may be true, and these, of course, are not denying that these are important elements in a Zika response. What I'm arguing is that this response very much focused on vector control and on individual behavior change towards vector control, neglected or contributed to obscuring a number of everyday emergencies that populations in South America, in Brazil, and particularly in the poorer regions of Brazil experience. These are, for example, the gender-based vulnerabilities. Zika is a very gendered problem that affects particularly women, young women who are pregnant, who are thinking about getting pregnant. It is a problem of poverty. It is true that mosquitoes do not distinguish between rich and poor when they are about to bite you, but mosquitoes do breed and reproduce in areas where there is no reliable access to safe water, where there is no adequate infrastructure, where people need to rely upon makeshift water containers in order to have a reliable water source. Zika is also a disease of poverty because it breeds and reproduces in areas where there is no sufficient information about how to prevent mosquito bites, how to prevent the worst symptoms of disease, and how to get access to the best quality of healthcare. It is also a matter of a problem of urbanization. Poor water and sanitation infrastructure unfortunately, in many cities and rural regions in Latin America. And also a problem of economic, cultural, and legal challenges to sexual and reproductive health. There is a problem in Latin America and in the world more generally about women's access to contraception, women's ability to control the sexual behavior of their partners, the use of contraception, and the access to reproductive health services, to family planning, and to abortion, safe abortion. There's also a question of lack of state support to families, and this is visible these days in the way in which families affected by Zika and affected by microcephaly are being left out in the cold without sufficient access. So all of these dimensions, all of these everyday emergencies have been arguably neglected by the Zika response, because Zika response was very much focused on containment, on vector control, on the kind of technological interventions or technical interventions that were to control the vectors and mosquitoes. So Zika, similarly to Ebola, became also a spectacle. There was a lot of attention. There was a lot of sound and fury on the headlines in the West because, for example, the growth of cases of microcephaly. There was also kind of a very solipsistic approach on the part of the Western media, a very solipsistic approach to Zika crisis. Zika was being a problem because there were a lot of people that were planning to come to Brazil, to come to Latin America because of the big sports events, but also on holidays, and that they couldn't make it, they couldn't come because of this epidemic. So again, the problem was not, or the focus was not placed on the suffering and the vulnerabilities that were experienced on a daily basis by the populations in Latin America, particularly the poor populations in Latin America, but on the inconveniences that would cause to Western nationals. So again, what I argue here is that that Zika has remained, by and large, a neglected issue throughout this process. Even though there is a lot of attention being paid to Zika, there is a lot of headlines about Zika. It is a very solipsistic, it's very much centered on Western interests, on the interests of the poor, of the richer nations, whereas the actual suffering of poorer populations is being obscured, is being silenced. And as I mentioned, the case of the Zika, the families who have been affected by Zika microcephaly is a particular case in point. And for me, the case of Zika, and this is kind of connecting back to what I was saying at the beginning about the conceptual understandings of health security, is an example then not just of the kind of the attempt to securitize a particular issue, but also of the use of a risk-based mentality. If you analyze how and why Zika was declared by the WHO as a public health emergency of international concern, what was declared a public health emergency was not Zika itself. This is important to bear in mind, but it was the then unknown association, or the then unexplained association between Zika and microcephaly. This association has then been explored, it's been studied, but then at the time of declaration of the public health emergencies, scientists and politicians did not know what was happening. They only knew that there seemed to be a correlation between the two. And this raised, of course, a great alarm, particularly in certain Western nations, in the context in which many Westerners were traveling to South America. It was the time of the Rio Olympics, etc. So there was a lot of concern about Western nationals here. And this uncertainty, again, the risk-based mentality, this uncertainty about Zika, what triggered WHO to declare public health emergency. So in the case of Zika, you had kind of a threat-based mentality. You had the securitization rationale. You had the risk-based approach by focusing on uncertainty, on events. The event here being the association between Zika and microcephaly. But arguably, and this is my argument, it did not pay sufficient attention to the daily vulnerabilities, what I would term the everyday emergencies. The everyday emergencies remained, by and large, unaddressed. Okay, so to conclude, how can we have, given what I just said, how can we have a sustainable health security? I think the primary focus, you may have guessed, should be focus on the vulnerabilities of individuals and groups. These may be direct vulnerabilities, particular diseases, but also indirect vulnerabilities like disease determinants, like access to a health system, social economic status, gender, sanitation infrastructure, access to reliable sources of water. So these are all determinants that constitute or may constitute vulnerabilities. We need, therefore, in order to have a sustainable health security, we need to combine our traditional measures to contain outbreaks, technological, the pharmacological instruments, which are undoubtedly important and crucial. They are very important to save lives. They have saved millions of lives in the past, but they are not enough. We need to combine these vaccines, these medicines, these fumigation strategies, all these technological and pharmacological tools with other broader political tools. And I argue that this needs to happen at 4 levels. On the one hand, at the national level, with public health systems strengthened, we need stronger public health systems. We need, at the community level or at the local level, we need to have health coverage that is able to respond to the particular demands and to the particular context at local level, because it is diverse. A country like Brazil, for example, where I've specialized, is incredibly diverse, and it's only via the work of community health workers or community-based approaches that we can have, that we can adequately respond to the specific needs of the populations. So we have the national level, we have the community or local level, and then, which is, I think, also particularly important in the context of UNESCO, we need to have regional cooperation, strong regional cooperation in health questions. This is because it is only at the regional level that we can find, or we can get close to, what I would call a community of interest. There is more in common between Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, and other countries than Ecuador, other countries than there is between, say, Brazil and Norway, or Sweden or Finland, or for that matter, China. I think there needs to be stronger realization of what unites particular regions of the world, particularly when it comes to respond to arboviruses, to mosquito-borne diseases like Zika or dengue fever. Countries need to realize and need to reinforce their cooperation at the regional level. I think this is essential because they have the true community of interest and share the same challenges, the same concerns at the regional level. And finally, of course, this regional cooperation or this reinforced regional cooperation needs to happen in or against the background of the development of a global solidarity, a global conception of health as a collective, as a public good, and the development of solidarity that can build and that can reinforce systems of surveillance and disease notification that are effective and that take into account the needs and the capacities of different regions and different states. So this is my view of how we can promote sustainable health security in the 21st century, starting from the bottom up, starting with the individual and group experiences of vulnerability, start with the everyday emergencies, and then move on to develop these multi-level systems of governance, starting with the local community-based approaches, the national health systems, regional integration that needs to be realized, and is also, I think, in my opinion, a missing link in global health governance. And finally, the global level, where there needs to be more solidarity between the North and the global South. Thank you very much.